And so David has now consolidated the nation. He has set up his capital city in Jerusalem. He's made it the military center. He's made it the financial center. He's made it the religious center by bringing the Ark of the Covenant there and setting it up in a tabernacle made specially for it. We talked last week about David desiring to build a house for the most holy piece of furniture, and David was sitting and relaxing and realizing that the Ark of the Lord, Ark of the Covenant, was sitting in a tent while he was sitting in a cedar-paneled palace, and he wanted to build a permanent home for God. And God, of course, made a promise, made an oath to David that was central to much of the rest of the Bible, actually, because we know that God is good for his promises, that, anything that he says will be done. And there's part of that promise that hasn't yet to be fulfilled, but it will be fulfilled at a future time when Jesus Christ returns and sets up his rule and reign in Jerusalem, and rules and reigns for 1,000 years. So we know that that's coming. Now we transition into talking about David's triumphs. And so the nation has experienced the greatest prosperity it's ever known. And David has military conquests and begins to expand its borders. So that's kind of a quick summary of what we're going to be looking at today. And yes, I did say 3 chapters, 8, 9, and 10. That's our objective today. We'll take them one at a time, and go with our group, that are grouped together. No problemo. We'll take it as it comes, but at least that's our plan. All right, any comments or questions before we start our read through? All right, so let's go ahead and turn to 2 Samuel chapter 8. In the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them. He took Metheg-Ammon from the control of the Philistines. David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought him tribute. Moreover, David defeated Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah, when he went to restore his monument at the Euphrates River. David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. King of Zobah, David struck down 20,000 of them. He put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans became subject to him and brought tribute. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David took the gold shields that belonged to the officers of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem from Teba and Berothea, towns that belonged to Hadadezer. King David took a great quantity of bronze. When Tou, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer, he sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and congratulate him on his victory in battle over Hadadezer, who had been at war with Tou. Joram brought with him articles of silver, of gold, and of bronze. King David dedicated these articles to the Lord, as he had done with the silver and gold from all the nations he had subdued: Edom, and Moab, the Ammonites, and Philistines, and Amalek. He also dedicated the plunder taken from Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army of Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud. I'm sorry, start over again. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder. Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Amalek, son of Abiathar, were priests. Seraiah was secretary. Benaniah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were priests. Whew! That was not an easy chapter to read. There's a lot of ancient names there, and they just don't run over the Anglo-Saxon tongue very well. All right, so that is chapter 8. And let's go back up to the top. It's interesting that it says in the course of time. Now, that's actually the way that the translators of the NIV decided to translate these first words of this sentence in 2 Samuel chapter 8. Other translations, you say, after this. And I think that that's a little bit more clear. Obviously, in the course of time, and the phrase after this ties back to what was previously, what had previously occurred. What previously occurred? Well, we talked about it. God made a promise, made an oath to David. So the connection is that after the covenant that God made with David, after the promise that God made to David, then David moves into this new phase of his kingdom. Again, he consolidates the nation, right? He is, instead of being a nation of 12 tribes, it now becomes one nation. And then he consolidates power to Jerusalem, and then he starts to expand the borders of the nation. So, and that all occurs after God makes his oath, his covenant, his promise with David. So in the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them. He took Amma from the control of the Philistines. So the Philistines were the perpetual enemy of Israel. And during this time of prosperity for David, he had military successes against the Philistines to the point that he took some of the Philistine territory and made it part of Israel. That would be the Methag Amma, previously in the control of the Philistines. And then David also defeated the Moabites. Now, this is interesting. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. Why would David do that? Well, we have the answer in the next sentence. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought him tribute. So if David would have just wiped out all of the Moabite soldiers, there wouldn't have been anybody to farm. There wouldn't have been anybody to keep the land going. And it was more equitable. That's not the right word. It made more economic sense for them to pay David tribute than to wipe them out. If you wiped them out, you have the spoils of war, but then you have nothing. But if you allow them to continue to function as an economy, they can contribute to your bottom line. So that's kind of interesting, the way that David went about it. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death. The 3rd length was allowed to live. So the point being that he allowed 1/3 to live, 2/3 were killed. And that's of the Moabites. And David, he expands his kingdom to the south, to the east, to the north. He can't expand it to the west because to the west is the Mediterranean. But part of the point that's being made in this chapter is that his expansion includes all of the directions available to him. That's part of the focus of this. There's some key verses here that we want to hit on. Moreover, verse 3, moreover, David defeated Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah, when he went to restore his monument at the Euphrates River. David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. Part of the wealth of a nation was measured in its horses. Again, you needed beasts of burden to keep the economy going. So he didn't hamstring all the horses, making them unavailable for war. And of course, you needed a horse to drive a chariot. And so therefore, he was limiting their military capability by limiting the number of horses that would be able to draw a chariot. And of course, chariots at the time were the epitome or the peak of military technology. You would have a person driving the chariot, and usually you'd have an archer riding along with, and so it was a mobile battle wagon. David captured 1,000 of the chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. When the Arameans of Damascus went to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down 20,000 of them. He put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans became subject to him and brought him tribute. Now, this is a key verse right here, this sentence. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. So the Lord's hand was on David, and the Lord gave him victory wherever he went. And the short sum of what we just read, so the Palestine, or the Philistia, there we go, Philistia and the Philistines were to the south. The Arameans of Damascus were to the north. And so David expanded the kingdom into Syria. The Moabites and Moab were to the east and were in the area that we know of today as Jordan. So that's his expansion north, south, and east. Verse 7, David took the gold shields that belonged to the officers of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. So David was able to take advantage of the spoils of war. But did he line his own coffers? Did he line his own treasure vault with those shields? No. All right, so David took the shields that belonged to the officers of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem from Teba and from Berothea, towns that belonged to Hadadezer. King David took a great quantity of bronze. When Tau, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer, he sent to send Joram to King David to greet him and congratulate him on his victory in battle over Hadadezer, who had been at war with Tau. Joram brought with him articles of silver, of gold, and of bronze. So that was a political treaty, right? So Joram, working as an emissary, brought David articles of gold and silver and of bronze. It was a way of saying, we appreciate what you've done, and we are loyal to you, and we will follow your lead, without actually David and his armies having to do anything to capture them. And they were basically feathering their own bed. So Tau, king of Hamath, was feathering his own bed, making sure that he was in a good position with David. And boy, it just worked out that they had been in battle with Hadadezer, and David took care of their problem. Further, King David dedicated these articles to the Lord. Ah, there it is. King David dedicated these articles to the Lord as he had done with the silver and gold from all the nations he had subdued. So it didn't go into his treasure vault. It didn't go into his bank account. It went to the Lord. And what would that mean? Well, that meant that it went in to making things for the tabernacle and for the supporting of the priests and the worship of the Lord there at the tabernacle where now the Ark of the Covenant resided. Verse 13. And David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. This is significant because if you'll remember, the Edomite people come from all of a sudden I have a mental blank. The son that gave up his birthright for a bowl of stew.
Esau.
Thank you. Boy, that was a mental breakdown. Yes, so Esau, they are descendants of Esau. And interestingly, they had been not necessarily enemies because they weren't like the Philistines, but the Israelites were no friend of the Edomites and the descendants of Esau. Well, he put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. Again, that's repeated the second time. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. And that is one of the salient points here. You can try and do things under your own steam. And you might experience some success. But you'll probably experience a lot of frustration. And if you want to achieve true success, you need to do it with God instead of without God. David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. This is the second major point of this chapter. So it talks about David expanding the nation of Israel into other territories that surrounded them. And at the same time, David becomes, for that day and age, he becomes a world power. Certainly a regional power, maybe even greater than a regional power, but he is in control of much of what we know today as the Middle East. And yet, so he had all of these people paying tribute, because that's what you did when you subjugated a people and a land. But even though David was in control of this, David reigned over all Israel, all the territories of Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. So David took the job seriously. And he was a just and right judge, king, ruler over these people. And this harkens to a future time when Jesus is the returned or restored David to the city of Jerusalem, ruling and reigning. There is no more just and right king than Jesus Christ himself. And it's interesting, this is another foreshadowing of a future time where through the lineage of David, a new David arrives. A new David rises up, and that new David is the most righteous and the most judge that a ruler can be. 16. Joab, son of Jeruiah, was over the army. So that was the captain of his army. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder. Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Elimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests. Seraiah was secretary. Benaniah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and the Palathites. And David's sons were priests. Well, there's a couple of things in here. This is telling us about David's administration. Who was his cabinet of advisors and leaders? We don't know much about this position of recorder. So Jehoshaphat was recorder. Now, that recorder could have been a historian, a scribe. It could have been just taking down, a scribe that took down the royal minutes, the royal meeting minutes. So we don't know a whole lot about that. Zadok, interestingly, becomes a major figure of representing the priesthood and functioning as the high priest, and he's legitimate. And in future times, there will be high priests that are not legitimate. There is a character, it's about 200 years before the birth of Christ, who actually raids the tomb of David because there were golden articles that were in the tomb of David. He raids the tomb, takes the gold articles, and use those to pay the Greek Seleucid king, who was at that time in charge over the land of Palestine. He pays him to buy the high priesthood and is considered to be illegitimate. And he's compared with Zadok, who was a legitimate high priest appointed by David. Then it says Seraiah was secretary, and we think that means Secretary of State, that sort of person that's responsible for foreign affairs. Benaniah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and the Palathites. These were peoples that were aligned with Israel but were not part of the nation of Israel. And then there's this weird last sentence or phrase, and David's sons were priests. So there's been quite a bit of discussion about what that means, because obviously David's sons did not come from the line of Aaron. They had no claim to be Levites. And yet what it says here is they were priests. And what most commentators believe or think is that they were responsible for overseeing the religious part of David's kingdom, and they likely supervised sacrifices but didn't perform them themselves. Which is also the response to the prior chapter, where during the celebration of bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, David puts on an ephod, which is a priestly garment, and chances are that David didn't do the sacrifices himself, but he supervised. He was there. He was in the presence. And so David's sons were made responsible to make sure that the worship of Israel was done right, done correctly, and had what it needed to continue. Any thoughts, comments, questions before we move on to chapter 9? All right, chapter 9.
Perry?
Oh, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah,
your audio cut out.
I was thinking about Esther, about Ruth, and certainly David. She would have been his grandmother or great-great-grandmother, but she was a Moabite, and I know that Moabites later, at the time of Nebuchadnezzar and any of the Babylonians, they certainly were no favorite of Israel. Matter of fact, they were, happy that Israel was being defeated and probably went after them. But I didn't realize they'd done anything at the time of David to warrant being 2/3 of the warriors to be cut up like firewood.
Right, right. Yeah, so there was a love-hate relationship between the Moabites and Israel for centuries, and I think that it can be similar to Ukraine and Russia. In between Ukraine and Russia, um, for many years, people traveled back and forth. And Russians have lived in Ukraine, and Ukrainians have lived in Russia. They share a common language. There are some slight differences, but if you learn to speak Ukrainian, you can understand 80% or more of Russian and vice versa. There are family members that, from Russian families, they have family members in Ukraine, and vice versa, Ukrainians that have family members in Russia. They have a common history or a shared history, and I think that it was, like I said, that it was very similar between the relationship between Israel and Moab. Anything else? All right, let's move to chapter 9, verse 1. David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "At your service," he replied. The king asked, and we're talking about David, the king asked, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Ziba answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lo Debar." So David had him brought from Lo Debar, from the house of Machir, son of Amiel. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, "Mephibosheth, at your service," he replied. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "Your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's households were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. He was lame in both feet. So you might recall earlier in 2 Samuel that in the rush to grab Mephibosheth, who was a young child at the time, and hide him away from David, that his feet were what we think injured, and he became lame in both feet, which meant that he could never work, and he would always be a burden to others. But he was the last remaining descendant of Saul, and he was the son of Jonathan. Now, there's a few interesting features about this particular chapter. So it was rather expected that when a new king came to power, the new king would kill all of the previous king's family members, the advisors, his officers, and his family members. It was just sort of something in the Middle East that was done. It was sort of expected. And that's why the nurse of Mephibosheth took him away in the process where he was injured, but took him away because they were trying to hide him to keep him from being killed by the new administration, the new king. David doesn't know anything about Mephibosheth. He didn't even know that he existed. Ziba is an interesting character. I would like to have met Ziba and to see what kind of person he was. I kind of think that he was a clever person, that he had figured out how kings and courts operate. He was, as it mentions in this chapter, he was the steward of Saul's servants. So he was the captain of Saul's servants. So a very experienced person and well-to-do. He himself, besides his sons, has 20 servants. So it's interesting, a servant having servants. So Ziba has done very well for himself. But Ziba understands where his bread is buttered from. And when King David orders him into service, again as a servant, for Mephibosheth, he immediately moves into that role. There's no argument. I haven't been an active service of a king in many years, and I'm getting rather aged, and I kind of want to travel. No, there's none of that. He immediately says, in your service. One of the things that's interesting about being in the presence of a king, that king can bless you and kill you at the same time, and just with a word. They can change the entire circumstances of your life. And David did that, not necessarily in a negative way, but he did that here for Ziba. All right, so back up to the top. David asked, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now, David was sincere in his motive. He wanted to find out if there was anyone left from the house of Saul. But there's a question mark here. Because if David found that anybody was left from the house of Saul, he could have them killed. So that there were no pretenders to the throne. There were no challengers to his throne. That is not David's objective. That is not David's motive. David's motives are pure. He definitely wants to honor Jonathan. Remember that Jonathan and David made an oath that they would look after their families after them. And David wants to make good on that oath that he made to Jonathan. And so he asks, is there still anyone left of the house of Saul? Now, I wonder if this was an educated question on David's part. I wonder if David suspected that there was somebody left. But he definitely didn't know about Mephibosheth. But he wants to make good on that oath that he made to Jonathan. And he loved Jonathan. And I think that the wording is interesting, that they had a relationship that was beyond what a man has with a woman. They were buddies. They were soulmates. They were companions. They were concerned and cared for each other. Verse 2. Now, there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. So people remembered Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? So he had heard about Ziba. No doubt somebody in David's court said, This guy named Ziba was Saul's steward of his servants, and Ziba's still around. So when Ziba comes before David, and David asks him, "Are you Ziba?" He doesn't reply, "Yes, I am." He replies, "At your service." So he's already communicating to David that he is subservient to whatever it is that King David is asking. Verse 3, the king asks, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Again, David is sincere in his motive. Ziba answered the king. Now, in Ziba answering the king, Ziba is giving up a secret that he has held for many years. And in a way, he's betraying Mephibosheth. He says, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." And I think that Ziba, by telling him that David that he's lame in both feet, he's also telling David he is no threat. Mephibosheth is in no position to marshal an army and to cause a revolt. There's no coup going to happen in the wings. He's no threat. But there is a son of Jonathan left. "Where is he?" the king asked. Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lo-debar." So Lo-debar would have been the town where Amiel was located, and specifically Mephibosheth was living at the house of Machir. This is where he was hidden away. Verse 5. So King David brought him from Lo-debar, from the house of Machir, son of Amiel. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, "Mephibosheth." And he replies, "At your service." So by Mephibosheth giving that response to David, he's telling David, "I will be subservient to you. Whatever it is that you ask my king, I will do for you." Verse 7, don't be afraid. And the reason that David says don't be afraid is because David could have had him killed, so that there was no pretender to the throne. There was nobody to challenge David. But again, that's not David's motives. "Don't be afraid," David said, "for I will surely show you kindness." Why? Why would he do this? "For the sake of your father Jonathan." And David is making good on his oath that he made to Jonathan and the love that he had for Jonathan. "I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul." Wow. No doubt all the land that previously belonged to Saul now belonged to David. And then he says, "And you will always eat at my table." So what David is telling him is, you will always have a place of honor here in my home. Verse 8, Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" What is he saying? Is he being self-deprecating? Well, yeah, actually he is. He's lame in both feet. He's good to no one. He can't work. He can't earn money. He's nothing but a boat anchor, for the people, or a stone, a millstone around people's necks, because he can't support himself. So why should you? I mean, I am the lowest of low. I am a flea on a dog. What is your servant that you should? Why do you care about me that you should notice a dead dog like me? Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for." So David is setting up a financial line of support for Jonathan's son. He gives the land to Mephibosheth because now that's a source of income. That's a source of revenue. And he can't work the land himself, and so he gives that responsibility to Ziba. And this now becomes Ziba's job, the job for Ziba's sons, for Ziba's sons, and for Ziba's servants. Their job is now to work the land that previously belonged to Saul, to bring in a crop to generate revenue for Mephibosheth. So David is taking care of Mephibosheth, both financially and physically. Physically, because he has told him that you will always have a place at the king's table. You will always have a place of honor at my table. And Mephibosheth, son of your master, will always eat at my table. Now, Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Certainly, Ziba had enough resources to be able to work the land, to do what it is that David is asking him to do. Then Ziba said to the king, your servant will do whatever your lord the king commands his servant to do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And that's exactly what David was doing. He was treating Jonathan's son like his son. And Mephibosheth became one of David's family. Verse 12. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's households were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem. Why? Because he always ate at the king's table. And then it ends by saying, no, this is the guy, this is the same guy. He's lame in both his feet. Now, there's some interesting spiritual principles built into this that I don't know if they are immediately obvious. So let's talk about them. We are all cripples before God. The sin in our lives cripples us before God. And God sees our sins. And yet, he invites us to dine at his table and to become his sons and daughters. And it's interesting to note that David extended this kindness to Mephibosheth because of his love for Jonathan. God the Father extends his love to us because of his love of his Son, Jesus Christ. And it was God's Son that had to die, not Abraham's son, not your son, not my son. It was God's Son who had to die to be the sacrifice, the perfect sacrifice for the remission of sins, to pay the debt. And that is why on the cross, Jesus says, Totalestai. It is finished. It is a debt that has been paid. David made a promise to Jonathan. God made a promise to his son. Because his son, Jesus, loved us, God the Father loves us too. And we are afforded the opportunity to not only eat at the king's table, but to become one of his family. David never said anything about Mephibosheth's feet. He didn't ever say a word about him being lame. Just like God the Father, when he looks at us through his Son, he sees us as forgiven. He sees us not as imperfect but perfect. He sees us not as incomplete but complete. He doesn't see us as being crippled by our sin, but he sees us washed and forgiven through his Son, Jesus Christ. It's also interesting to note that beyond asking, equivocating himself as a dead dog, Mephibosheth never mentions anything about his feet. There are a lot of Christians that never forgive themselves, even though they've been washed by the blood of Christ, even though they have been made white as snow. They never forgive themselves. And because they never forgive themselves, they are keeping their crippledness in mind. They never feel like they've been fully accepted by God, even though they have. They don't feel that they deserve the forgiveness that God has given them. And there are non-believers who have considered being believers, becoming sons and daughters of Jesus Christ. But they don't allow themselves to do that, to receive the forgiveness, because they believe they don't deserve it. Why would God ever forgive a person like me? Why would he do that? I'm not worth it. And then the other thing to note is that others in David's court, they accepted Mephibosheth, and they never mentioned anything about his feet. They never mentioned anything about his lameness. And we, as brothers and sisters in Christ, we need to accept our brothers and sisters just as they are. We're not to look down at them and say, he's a worse sinner than me. No, we are all equal under the eyes of the Lord. And we're to accept everyone just as they are. And all of us, every single one of us, through the power of the Holy Spirit, is a work in progress. All right. Thoughts, comments before we move on to chapter 10?
I was looking at thinking about David assigning his sons to be priests. That's part of the corruption that got started in David's house.
Is it, Daryl? Is it part of the corruption?
Well, you see that they would try to, move the ark, and they wasn't doing it right. And, basically they got punished for that.
Yeah, so I think that David was doing what was expedient instead of what was right in the case of the ark, and having a cart built for it and not moving it the proper way. So I don't know if it's part. I mean, there is a corruption that happens within David's household, and it actually reaches its apogee or its apex in Solomon's day, and it's really brought upon by idolatry, where Solomon, whether they were political marriages or not, David has 1,000 wives and concubines, and many of those wives were part of political treaties. And so they were foreign, and they brought their foreign gods with them. And where it started is that Solomon allowed them to continue to worship their idols and foreign gods, even though they were now, in Solomon's court. And then they would say, Solomon, I haven't seen you in so long. Here, just sit here while I worship my God. Just sit here. And then it would be, oh, Solomon, you're just sitting there. Why don't you go ahead and join me? And all of a sudden, Solomon fell into idolatry himself. And Solomon becomes a example of how not to finish well. One of the wisest people who has ever lived did not finish his life well. One of the interesting things about this section that we're reading here of 2 Samuel, and we're focusing on David's triumphs, is that we have a tendency to focus on David's failures, or we remember David's failures. When we started talking about David this morning, one of the guys first brought up Bathsheba, and he shouldn't have been on the roof. Isn't it interesting that for some reason that's what we remember? We remember David for his failures and not for his successes. And David, just like it says in at the end of chapter 8, was that he was a right and just ruler. David was a very good man. But just like any of us, David had his faults and his weaknesses. And yet, God still called him his beloved. And the reason that he did that is that David always repented. David's heart always remained soft enough that he returned to God and that he would ask for forgiveness and he would sincerely desire God's forgiveness. You know, it's one thing to just say, God, would you forgive me? And to not really mean it. But David meant it. And because David always returned to God, he was God's beloved. Not that David was perfect, because he wasn't, but because David always had a heart for God. And for me, that's encouraging, right? That David always had a heart for God, that David was not perfect, that God loved him, continued to love him despite his imperfections and his failures. And as I mentioned, before we started our study this morning, that, right now we're looking at a section of 2 Samuel that focuses on David's triumphs. And next week we start looking on a new section that focuses on David's failures, David's troubles. All right, for time, let's move over to 2 Samuel chapter 10. In the course of time, the king of the Ammonites died, and his son Hanun succeeded him as king. David thought, I will show kindness to Hanun, son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. So David sent a delegation to express sympathy to Hanun concerning his father. When David's men came to the land of the Ammonites, the Ammonite commander said to Hanun, their lord, do you think David is honoring your father by sending envoys to you to express sympathy? Notice the question mark, it's key. Hasn't David sent them to you only to explore the city and spy it out and overthrow it? So Hanun seized David's envoys, shaved off half of each man's beard, cut off their garments at the buttocks, and sent them away. When David was told about this, he sent messengers to meet the men, for they were greatly humiliated. The king said, stay at Jericho till your beards have grown, and then come back. When the Ammonites realized that they had become obnoxious to David, they hired 20,000 Aramean foot soldiers from Beth Rehob, house of Rehob, and Zobah, as well as the king of Maacah with 1,000 men, and also 12,000 men from Tob. On hearing this, David sent Joab out with the entire army of his fighting men. The Ammonites came out and drew up in battle formation at the entrance of their city gate, while the Arameans of Zobah and Rehob and the men of Tob and Maacah were by themselves in open country. Joab saw that there were battle lines in front of him and behind him, so he selected some of the best troops in Israel and deployed them against the Arameans. He put the rest of the men under the command of Abishai, his brother, and deployed them against the Ammonites. Joab said, "If the Arameans are too strong for me, then you are to come to my rescue. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will come to your rescue. Be strong, and let us fight bravely for our people and the cities of our God. And the Lord will do what is right in his sight." Then Joab and the troops with him advanced to fight the Arameans, and they fled before him. When the Ammonites realized that the Arameans were fleeing, they fled before Abishai and went inside the city. So Joab returned from fighting the Ammonites and came to Jerusalem. After the Arameans saw that they had been routed by Israel, they regrouped. Hadadezer had Arameans brought from beyond the Euphrates. They went to Halam and Shobach, the commander of Hadadezer's army, leading them. When David was told of this, he gathered all Israel, crossed the Jordan, and went to Helam. The Arameans formed their battle lines to meet David and fought against him. But they fled before Israel, and David killed 700 of their charioteers and 40,000 of their foot soldiers, and he struck down Shobach and the commander of their army, and he died there. And when all the kings who were vassals of Hadadezer saw that they had been routed by Israel, they made peace with the Israelites and became subject to them. So the Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites anymore. Okay, so this is talking about a big battle that occurred, and it does have a couple of interesting features that we'll talk about quickly here. So David, again, being pure in his motives, truly wanted to show sympathy for the death of the Ammonite king, and so he sent emissaries, an envoy, to Hanan to express his sympathy. But then the advisors of Hanan said, why do you think David's doing this? Is he really going to come and show his sympathy? No. What's really going on here is David is using this as an opportunity to scout our city. He has plans to capture us, to take over us, and he's sending the emissaries to scout the city and spy on us, which is not the truth at all. That's not what happened at all. So in response to basically tell David that they're nobody's fools, Hanan has the men and David's envoy humiliated. He cuts off half their beards, and he cuts their garments so that their butts are showing. It's terribly humiliating. David understands when he hears what Hanan had done with David's men. He understands the humiliation involved, and he tells them to stay in Jericho until their beards grew back. And I'm sure he told them to go ahead and, on David's dime, go ahead and get some new clothes. Jericho would have been the closest city on the way back. So he tells them, hang out there until your beards grow back so that they don't experience any humiliation when they return to David's court. So all of a sudden, the Ammonites realize that they now have become anathema. The word that the NIV uses is obnoxious. The word that the King James uses is stench. Matter of fact, the words in the King James are, they have become a stench in David's nose. I think that's a lot more graphic than the word obnoxious. Point's about the same. So when they realized that they become obnoxious to David, their response was to hire mercenaries from around the area. So they paid good money, lots of money, to hire mercenaries to fight against David should David send his armies. And David does send his armies. But remember, God is with David, and God brings David success. There's a parallel passage that I want to look at with you. And it is in 1 Chronicles So remember, it's 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. We're in 1st Chronicles, and we're in chapter 19. And it's a parallel passage. So it is giving us additional information about the same situation. So turn with me to 1 Chronicles chapter 19, and we're going to start looking at verse 6. When the Ammonites realized that they had become a stench in David's nostrils, Hanun and the Ammonites sent 1,000 talents of silver to hire chariots and charioteers from Aram Naharaim, Aram Makkah, and Zobah. They hired 22,000 chariots and charioteers, as well as the kings of Makkah and his troops, who came and camped near Medeba, while the Ammonites were mustered from their towns and moved out for battle. On hearing this, David sent Joab, who was the captain of his armies, his chief general, out with the entire army of fighting men. And the Ammonites came out and drew up in battle formation at the entrance to their city, while the kings who had come by themselves were in open country. Joab saw that there were battle lines in front of him and behind him. So he was basically sandwiched between the enemy forces, and he knows he can't make a two-pronged success. He doesn't have the men to be able to fight two battles at the same time. So he has to focus his resources. Joab saw that there were battle lines in front of him and behind him, so he selected some of the best troops in Israel and deployed them against the Arameans. He put the rest of the men under the command of Abishai, his brother, and they were deployed against the Ammonites. Joab said, if the Arameans are too strong for me, then you are to rescue me. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will rescue you. See, he doesn't have enough troops to fight two battles at the same time. So this is a method, a system of backing each other up, having each other's back. Be strong and let us fight bravely for our people and the cities of our God. The Lord will do what is good in his sight. Then Joab and the troops with him advanced to fight the Arameans, and they fled before them. And the Ammonites saw that the Arameans were fleeing, and they too fled before his brother Abishai, and went inside the city. So Joab went back to Jerusalem, and it doesn't say so here, but he went back to Jerusalem victorious. Closing thoughts, comments? Again, this week we focused on David's triumphs. Next week we'll begin to study out David's troubles. Gentlemen, thanks for being here today. Please have a good rest of your week and go with God.
You too, Perry. Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thanks, Perry.